Good morning. I always use and in fact I have a set of dolls, but they were reluctant to travel this morning. They thought they'd stay at home and do some gardening. Why? Because we can't look at things in isolation. We have to take a holistic view of what is happening. That if we look at credit, then we have to look at learning. If we look at learning, we have to look at the student. If we look at the student, we have to look at their cognitive skills. If we're considering their cognitive skills, we have to consider pedagogy. If we're looking at pedagogy, then we have to go back to learning. Learning fits in with credit, credits fit into frameworks, frameworks fit into systems, systems fit into Bologna, Bologna fits into a greater global community of higher education. And currently, I spend a lot of my time working for an American foundation on matters related to Bologna, matters related to tuning and to qualification frameworks in particular. Tuning is being looked at in Australia. Qualifications frameworks, Australia, Canada, South Africa. China's looking at these things. Malaysia, Russia tuning, Japan, bless them, looking at qualifications frameworks and the Bologna process. And what I talk about is the tuning family, the family of higher education that is focused on learning. And when we think about learning, the Americans have now coined the phrase the 21st century student. And there's a fantastic little clip on YouTube, I don't know if you've seen it, called Students of Today, which is from Ohio State University. There is no dialogue to it, it's just fantastic. It's just students holding up placards saying 12% of my lecturers know my name. I read for 16 hours a day, 3 hours of that is for study. I use the computer. This laptop costs more than a family in country X uses to feed themselves for a year, and so on. So it's a very powerful message, but it's also a very powerful message of learning. And as was said this morning, it's a very easy trap to fall into, to think that this is 1968. It is not. This is 2011. The students have great skills, can do many things that their faculty cannot do, but they're different. And difference, I think, is to be gloried in. And when I first started with Erasmus courses and a double degree program, we always used the phrase, nothing is better, things are different. And you have to analyse, because then people will say, why do you do that? You think, because we've always done it. Not good enough. We have to learn, and we have to move on. So we have to look at learning. We have to look at student-centred. We have to look at cognitive skills. We have to look at multitasking. We have to really consider and think about what to know, understand, and be able to do means. We have to therefore look at lifelong learning. We have to look at credit, and we have to look at how much effort a typical student needs to put in to gain credit. So we have this very interlinked, interrelated, complex system that we call higher education, and at times we try to simplify. So very important that, to my mind, that we take all these things into consideration. Equally, of course, have great interest in semiotics. Being a lawyer, the only thing we have to play with are words. We lead a lonely life. And therefore, the meaning of words is very important. Raimonda has talked about learning outcomes and competences. And again, different spellings of competences. I often put an I in it. A word that I interject and use as a prefix very often is active learning outcomes, because I think there is a tendency to say we write a curriculum, we write the learning outcomes, and we put it in a desk drawer. That's not, as Raimonda's diagram has shown, what it's about. This is an iterative process. It is a circle and cycle of learning, and therefore we have to be active, and we have to understand that these learning outcomes are there for a purpose, not merely as decoration. A guy in the United States called Cliff Adelman, who works for the Higher Education Policy Institute and wrote the Bologna Club, he coined the phrase ratcheting up. And this goes back to Bloom and Bloom's taxonomy. It's all in the verbs. The verbs ratchet up. You can look at a piece of knowledge and you can describe around that knowledge, or you can start to analyze, you can start to compare and contrast, and the cognitive complexity required to achieve the learning outcomes and therefore gain assessment becomes more and more difficult. As we progress through the Dublin descriptors, through levels of learning, then we should be challenging intellectually more as we go along. And we have to keep this very clearly in our mind's eye. Now, I use this ALT because the university where I used to work, and I use the phrase that I'm a Professor Emeritus. Emeritus is a title much used in the United Kingdom at the moment for many more people. Some people say it's for has-beens. Has been here, has been there, and now just has been. But what it means is that we do have a wealth of experience. And my university changed about 10 years ago from teaching, learning and assessment to assessment, learning and teaching. And we had it drilled into us. This was not merely a reordering of words. It was a reordering, therefore, of concepts and importance. As Raimonda has said, learning outcomes have to be assessed. There is no point in having them if they cannot be assessed and therefore used as a measure to gain credit, and credit then becomes the building block to gain a qualification. Very important. But if we write learning outcomes, the first question has to be, can you assess it? Not can you teach it, or can they learn it, but can you, as an academic, as a member of faculty, assess this, and can the student clearly understand what they have to know, understand, and be able to do to achieve the learning outcomes and therefore gain credit and therefore build towards a qualification. So it does become, I think, an important thing to contemplate whether or not it is ALT, not TLA or even LTA. So it moves from teaching, learning and assessment away to learning, teaching and assessment, more student-centred, and then assessment, learning and teaching, student-centred, and focusing on the fact that the learning outcomes have to be capable of being assessed. So we've seen the Russian dolls, the interlinked way in which it happens, and then as well, Raimonda talked about the time that it takes for a student to study. And of course, if we are wedded to lifelong learning, and we are, and therefore if we recognise prior learning and prior experiential learning and forms of learning, which we are, then we have to, in my mind, recognise that people learn in different ways, with different styles. More and more people do not attend university in a conventional leave high school, go to university, study on a campus, and go through the system. People are dipping into higher education to reskill themselves for jobs. People are returning to higher education. People are